History isn't written by the victors, it's written by guys trying to cover up their massive screw-ups. We are exposing 50 times the American public was blatantly lied to, manipulated, or just too distracted to notice the truth. Forget the sterilized textbooks. This is the unvarnished, deeply embarrassing reality of our national myths. 1. 2 hours of prime television, 30 million viewers, and one extremely dusty basement. In 1986, Geraldo Rivera hyped up the live opening of Al Capone's secret vault, heavily implying we would find mob gold, bodies, or at least a mountain of illegal booze. America brought the popcorn, but the mobster left us nothing but dirt and a few empty glass bottles. It was a massive cultural faceplant. We tuned in expecting a glittering underworld treasure hunt, and instead got a live broadcast of a man staring at a concrete wall, permanently redefining the concept of a national anticlimax. 2. Long before the internet invented clickbait, the New York Sun pulled off a legendary scam in 1835. They published highly detailed articles claiming a massive new telescope had discovered life on the moon. Not just boring craters, but Gothic temples, magical unicorns, and human bat hybrids soaring through the lunar sky. The entire city absolutely lost its collective mind, buying up every newspaper in sight. The wild truth? A bunch of desperate writers literally hallucinated the whole thing, just to boost sales. No telescope, no Batman. Just 19th century fake news that an entire metropolis swallowed whole. 3. Promising a glorious secret plan and an impending political storm, QAnon hooked millions by treating conspiracy theories like a high-stakes digital scavenger hunt. Followers were told hidden messages would expose global villains and fix the world overnight. Instead of delivering a grand revelation, this bizarre movement handed out ruined Thanksgiving dinners, shattered family relationships, and a completely new dictionary of internet nonsense. The anonymous authors survived simply by moving the goalposts every time a prophecy failed. Reality never stood a chance against a highly addictive, never-ending digital fantasy. 4. Calling the Y2K bug. A massive hoax is easily the most disrespectful rewrite of modern history. People love joking that the year 2000 panic was just mass hysteria because our toasters did not turn evil and airplanes stayed in the sky. But the apocalypse was only canceled because thousands of stressed-out software engineers spent years frantically rewriting ancient computer code. They completely saved the global infrastructure from a digital heart attack. And how did society thank them? By viciously mocking them because the disaster never happened. That is like yelling at a firefighter for ruining your lawn. 5. American classrooms absolutely love crowning guys like Thomas Edison and Benjamin Franklin as solitary wizards of invention. We are heavily conditioned to believe these men just sat alone in dark rooms until magical light bulbs appeared above their heads. Real innovation is a chaotic, crowded mess of brilliant assistants, fierce rivals, and stolen international ideas. The lone genius is just a fantastic marketing gimmick that looks great on a poster. The actual workshop smelled like burning solder, cheap coffee, and about 20 exhausted, uncredited nerds doing all the heavy lifting to make one famous guy look incredibly smart. 6. Grab a random person on the street, ask who invented the automobile, and they will confidently shout Henry Ford. They would also be completely wrong. German engineers beat General Motors and Ford to the actual invention by a very long shot. Ford just figured out how to build the thing so ridiculously fast that his own factory workers could finally afford to buy them. He weaponized the assembly line and permanently welded his name to the concept of driving. Americans simply prefer celebrating a hometown industrialist over admitting some guys in Europe actually did the homework first. 7. The infamous Twinkie defense proves that journalists will gladly ignore complex legal arguments if they can squeeze a bakery joke into the headline. Popular legend claims a murderer literally got a lighter sentence by arguing that eating too much junk food made him temporarily insane. The actual defense lawyers simply argued their client was deeply depressed, pointing to his sudden diet of sugary garbage as a tragic symptom of mental collapse. But nuance does not sell papers. The media took a grim tragedy, shrink-wrapped it into a snack cake punchline, and shipped a fabricated legal loophole nationwide. 8. Pop culture has completely brainwashed us into believing the Salem witch trials involved dramatic bonfires and women burning at the stake. While that fiery execution method was a massive hit in parts of Europe, North America was far more bureaucratic. In late 17th century Massachusetts, convicted citizens were simply hanged. In one exceptionally brutal incident, an elderly man was slowly crushed to death under heavy stones. We only borrowed the blazing stake imagery from European textbooks because Hollywood directors quickly realized that hanging is just not as visually spectacular as a giant roaring Halloween bonfire. 9. In 2009, the entire nation stopped working to watch a giant silver Jiffy Pop container float across the Colorado sky. News anchors panicked, heavily narrating the impending doom of a 6-year-old boy supposedly trapped inside the runaway homemade aircraft. The actual reality? The kid was safely eating snacks in the family attic the entire time. His parents had aggressively engineered the ultimate fake emergency just to land a lucrative reality television pitch. Millions of Americans were emotionally held hostage by a shiny tarp full of helium, proving we will watch anything with a breaking news graphic. 10. Decades of classic cinema have trained us to picture the Wild West as an exclusive club for rugged white guys with perfect jawlines. The studios aggressively sold us a completely monochrome frontier. Out on the actual cattle trails, roughly 1 in 4 cowboys was a black man working alongside highly skilled Mexican vaqueros. They did the exact same backbreaking, brutal work, surviving stampedes and terrible food. But when it came time to print the movie posters, Hollywood executives conveniently fired everyone else and handed the lassos to white actors, permanently bleaching a deeply diverse American history. 11. Your mother aggressively warning you that breakfast is the most important meal of the day sounds like ancient medical wisdom. It is actually a highly successful marketing scam cooked up by serial executives. In the early 20th century, these guys needed to sell massive quantities of processed grains. They heavily funded biased health articles, successfully weaponizing nutritional guilt to convince the public that skipping their sugary flakes would ruin your metabolism. You do not biologically require a giant bowl of artificial coloring at dawn. You are just a victim of a century-old advertising campaign starring a cartoon tiger. 12. The iconic 1869 photograph of the Golden Spike ceremony perfectly captures the glorious moment America united its coasts by rail. A bunch of very important men in heavy suits are shaking hands and looking incredibly proud. Missing from the picture? The thousands of Chinese immigrants who literally blasted through solid granite mountains with raw explosives to make the railway possible. They laid tracks at a deadly pace, yet were conveniently shoved completely out of the frame when the cameras arrived. That historical erasure was not a casual oversight. It was highly intentional, carefully curated political casting. 13. Political campaigns thrive on terror, and the 1960 missile gap was absolute rocket fuel. Politicians loudly terrified the public by claiming the Soviets had built a colossal nuclear arsenal that left America completely defenseless. Citizens panicked and started shopping for underground fallout shelters. There was only one minor issue. Classified intelligence already confirmed the gap was entirely fake, and the United States actually held a massive military advantage. But telling voters they are perfectly safe does not win elections. The lie was sleek, fast, and completely immune to the boring truth locked in a government filing cabinet. 14. Starting a massive international conflict sometimes only requires a catchy headline and a complete lack of evidence. When the USS Maine tragically exploded in Havana Harbor in 1898, American newspaper publishers saw dollar signs. Without waiting for a single official investigation, they printed massive stories declaring Spanish agents had deliberately torpedoed our ship. "Remember the Maine" became the furious battle cry that sparked a war. Modern experts suggest it was likely just a deeply unfortunate coal fire in the engine room. But engine failures do not sell newspapers, while absolute certainty on page 1 guarantees a frenzy. 15. Elementary school teachers did us all a massive disservice by framing the first Thanksgiving as a neat, polite dinner party. We were sold a beautiful picture of pilgrims and Native Americans sharing turkey, cranberry sauce, and pumpkin pie. The historical reality was a tense, multi-day diplomatic gathering filled with incredibly complex political maneuvering, and nobody was eating your grandmother's stuffing. The menu featured eel, seal meat, and venison. The cozy buckle hat wearing postcard myth was heavily manufactured centuries later to create a unifying national holiday. History is a messy business, but we prefer it neatly packaged in a can. 16. Millions of tourists drag their families to Massachusetts yearly just to stare at a deeply unimpressive chunk of granite called Plymouth Rock. We are told this is the exact geographical spot where the Pilgrims landed. The funny part? Nobody even mentioned the rock until 1741, when an elderly man literally just pointed at it based on a vague rumor. Since then, we have cracked it, glued it, dragged it around town, and built a massive Roman temple over it. The Pilgrims would have absolutely no idea what it is, but local gift shops love the massive revenue. 17. The popular story of George Washington having wooden teeth is the ultimate historical cover-up disguised as a charming fun fact. We teach kids that the founding father chomped down on splintery oak dentures because it makes him sound like a humble, relatable lumberjack. The truth is vastly darker and highly uncomfortable for a classroom. His actual dentures were a terrifying contraption made of lead, hippopotamus ivory, and actual human teeth purchased from the people he enslaved. Society simply prefers imagining our first president doing a cute woodworking craft rather than facing the brutal ugliness of 18th century realities. 18. Senator Joseph McCarthy was the absolute king of pretending to hold a winning poker hand when he actually just had a napkin full of scribbles. In the 1950s, he terrified Washington by wildly waving a piece of paper, claiming it was a secret list of known communists infiltrating the government. The wildest part was how the number of names constantly shifted depending on his mood. He ruined countless careers without ever producing a single shred of solid proof. Fear did all the heavy lifting while the actual facts were completely locked out of the building. 19. Textbooks love to boldly declare that Abraham Lincoln simply grabbed a magical pen, signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and instantly ended slavery overnight. It makes for a beautiful cinematic ending, but the actual document was incredibly messy and highly political. That specific executive order only declared freedom for enslaved people in the rebelling Confederate states where Lincoln had zero actual authority. It completely ignored those enslaved in loyal border states. Actual physical freedom usually arrived much later, marching closely behind Union bayonets. History absolutely hates complicated legal nuances, but politicians have always heavily relied on them to survive. 20. Before the government started heavily regulating the medical industry, you could apparently sell people literal poison as long as the bottle looked scientific. In the 1920s, a glowing radioactive water called Radithor was marketed as the ultimate energy drink. Advertisements promised endless youth, and wealthy Americans were literally chugging liquid radiation with their morning eggs. The fun completely stopped when a famous millionaire drank so much his jaw disintegrated and his bones collapsed. It took a highly publicized, gruesome death for America to realize that consuming the exact same chemicals used in atomic bombs is bad for digestion. 21. Corporate spin doctors completely manipulated the public during the 1994 McDonald's hot coffee lawsuit. Late-night comedians framed it as a greedy, clumsy woman who spilled a lukewarm latte and won millions. The actual trial evidence paints a horrific picture. The coffee was kept at near-boiling temperatures, causing catastrophic third-degree burns that required extensive skin grafts. The company already had hundreds of previous burn complaints but ignored them to save time. A highly paid PR machine magically turned a victim of extreme negligence into the ultimate national punchline for frivolous lawsuits. 22. A bizarre fairy tale still circulates in schools claiming Christopher Columbus bravely sailed into the unknown to prove the Earth was round, while everyone else feared falling off the edge. This is complete historical garbage. Every educated 15th century sailor already knew perfectly well that the planet was a sphere. The actual debate was strictly about the math. Columbus insisted the ocean was much smaller than reality. His calculations were horribly wrong, and he only survived because a giant continent was sitting in his way. Centuries later, clever writers simply rebranded his massive mathematical error as legendary scientific genius. 23. For decades, the most powerful cop in America stubbornly refused to acknowledge the mafia even existed. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover loudly insisted organized crime was a total myth, completely ignoring the massive mob funerals regularly blocking city traffic. While local cops and journalists documented huge national crime syndicates, Hoover spent his massive budget chasing bank robbers and political activists. It finally took a heavily publicized state police raid on a huge mobster convention in upstate New York to humiliate the Bureau into action. The nation's top detective basically stuck his fingers in his ears for 20 years. 24. Thinking the Liberty Bell wildly rang out across Philadelphia on the exact afternoon of July 4th is a cute, highly manufactured postcard myth. The actual historical timeline is aggressively boring. The public reading of the Declaration did not even happen until days later, and nobody was dramatically smashing giant bells to celebrate. In fact, that famous crack tourists line up to photograph likely did not even happen until decades after the Revolutionary War. The bell is essentially just a poorly manufactured piece of metal that heavily relies on our desperate need for cinematic sound design in American history. 25. Buying a new pair of loafers in the mid-20th century involved a shockingly unhinged dose of dangerous radiation. Shoe stores aggressively installed fluoroscope machines, which were essentially unshielded X-ray boxes, strictly to help salesmen measure foot sizes. Parents thought it was fantastic family entertainment to let children stare at their glowing green toe bones. The colorful signage promised a high-tech perfect fit, completely ignoring the terrifying reality that clerks and customers were soaking up massive daily radiation doses. Science eventually advanced, and these radioactive torture boxes were permanently retired to the Museum of Incredibly Terrible Retail Ideas. 26. The phrase "clean coal" is an absolute masterpiece of linguistic gymnastics, serving as the industrial equivalent of trying to sell a friendly rattlesnake. Politicians and energy executives aggressively push this magical concept, suggesting that if we just throw enough marketing budget at a deeply dirty fossil fuel, it becomes environmentally pure. While carbon capture technology actually exists in a laboratory, the physics and crushing financial costs make it practically impossible on a massive national scale. Instead of admitting defeat, the industry just keeps inventing clever new adjectives, proving their best public relations move is a total linguistic rebrand. 27. Normal suburban parents completely lost their minds during the 1980s satanic panic. Perfectly rational adults suddenly believed local daycare centers were secret headquarters for underground cults performing midnight sacrifices. News anchors reported wildly unhinged stories of secret tunnels and shape-shifting teachers with an entirely straight face. After millions of dollars in aggressive investigations, authorities found exactly 0 hidden sacrificial dungeons. They only found highly manipulated testimony from terrified toddlers and dozens of completely destroyed innocent lives. America held massive medieval exorcisms for absolutely no reason, proving daytime television is the fastest way to spread mass hysteria. 28. Tobacco companies deserve an Evil Genius Award for convincing the public that punching microscopic holes in a cigarette filter turned a deadly habit into wellness. They aggressively marketed light cigarettes as a smooth, responsible option for smokers nervous about lung disease. The biological reality was incredibly dark. Because the smoke was diluted by tiny air holes, nicotine addicts simply dragged much deeper and held the toxic smoke in their lungs way longer to get the exact same chemical fix. The fancy white filter never actually filtered out your cancer risk. It just highly effectively filtered out your guilt. 29. The construction industry spent decades treating asbestos like a magical fireproofing fairy dust sent straight from heaven. When factory workers started developing horrifying lung conditions, corporate executives casually dismissed the intense medical warnings as pure public hysteria. They aggressively defended the highly profitable mineral, completely ignoring the terrifying fact that its microscopic fibers were basically shredding human lungs. Courtrooms eventually flooded with tragic mesothelioma cases, acting as a very grim ledger for a massive corporate cover-up. It was a spectacular decades-long lie that confidently wore a yellow hard hat and suffocated thousands to keep profit margins healthy. 30. True corporate propaganda peaked with the iconic Keep America Beautiful campaign. They ran incredibly famous television commercials featuring a crying actor aggressively scolding the average citizen for throwing trash on the highway. It made everybody feel terrible. The massive twist? The campaign was secretly funded by the exact same massive beverage corporations that were producing billions of tons of disposable plastic garbage. Instead of taking responsibility for heavily polluting the planet, they successfully shifted the entire burden of guilt onto the consumer. They completely changed the national conversation just by pointing an accusatory finger at regular people. 31. Political campaigns heavily rely on catchy stereotypes, perfectly illustrated by the devastating legend of the welfare queen. During the 1970s, politicians painted a horrifying picture of a lazy mastermind driving luxury Cadillacs by aggressively defrauding government assistance programs. The terrifying reality is that this entire national panic was based on one extreme criminal outlier. Her bizarre story was hyperinflated to terrify taxpayers and aggressively push massive real-world policy changes that stripped funding from millions of struggling families. The lie worked absolute magic because getting voters furious at a fictional villain is vastly easier than explaining poverty statistics. 32. You really have to admire the sheer audacity of a journalist who casually invents fake history just for personal amusement. In 1917, a witty American columnist published a highly detailed article claiming bathtubs were legally banned as medical hazards until 1842. He boldly wrote that a wildly brave president finally installed the first patriotic tub in the White House. The entire timeline was a complete hallucination. Yet highly educated professors cited it, and prestigious newspapers treated it as absolute gospel. Even after he publicly confessed to the massive prank, the lie completely overshadowed the boring truth. 33. California historians spent 40 deeply embarrassing years worshipping a piece of metal that looked like a discarded washing machine part. Experts proudly announced they had found a legendary brass plate left behind by explorer Sir Francis Drake in 1579. It was heavily guarded in museums and celebrated in countless textbooks. The intensely humiliating problem? Advanced metallurgy tests eventually revealed the rare artifact was made of heavily modern rolled brass. It turned out to be an incredibly elaborate inside joke created by a local historical society that spiraled completely out of control, becoming a monumental academic faceplant. 34. We are heavily conditioned to believe that the beloved American streetcar naturally died off because everyone simply fell head over heels in love with their private automobiles. That is a highly sanitized corporate fairy tale. The actual death of the electric trolley system had incredibly aggressive assistance. A massive consortium connected to General Motors and huge oil companies systematically bought up transit systems specifically to tear up the tracks and replace them with gas-guzzling buses. Public transportation did not just accidentally slip and fall. The massive asphalt empire heavily funded a highly coordinated hit squad to bury it. 35. Every single October, local news anchors stare deeply into the camera and terrify suburban parents with warnings about deranged strangers shoving razor blades into Halloween candy. We treat the neighborhood like a massive minefield of lethal chocolate bars. But looking at decades of police data reveals the stranger danger panic is almost entirely a myth. The vast majority of these horrifying incidents were elaborate pranks by the kids themselves, desperate copycats, or terrible family members trying to cover up crimes. Neighborhood supervillains handing out toxic gummy bears simply do not exist, but the paranoia absolutely guarantees massive television ratings. 36. Sociological fiction rarely gets as sneaky as the model minority myth. It is a toxic concept designed to complement one group while violently insulting everyone else. The widespread idea claims Asian Americans achieve success solely due to a magical cultural devotion to hard work, conveniently ignoring wildly different immigration histories and economic advantages. Politicians love pulling this shiny stereotype out to proudly claim systemic racism does not exist, pitting minority communities against each other. Wrapping an offensive stereotype in a pristine university graduation gown does not make it a fact. 37. Pharmaceutical companies committed the crime of the century by distributing a beautifully designed fairy tale directly to American doctors. Purdue Pharma launched a heavily funded campaign, assuring medical professionals their new pain pills carried practically zero risk of addiction. They paraded around a fabricated statistic, claiming less than 1% of patients would get hooked. Armed with free luxury pens, sales reps pushed this devastating lie into clinics everywhere. Profits skyrocketed, while a slow-motion national catastrophe masqueraded as compassionate medical care, quietly piling up body bags in small towns. 38. The unhinged birther movement proved that if you yell loudly enough into a microphone, you can successfully turn a basic clerical document into a massive constitutional crisis. A terrifyingly large portion of the country became absolutely obsessed with demanding the birth certificate of a sitting president. Even after multiple courts, highly verified state documents, and major newspapers completely debunked the ridiculous claim, the wild rumors refused to die. The absolute lack of evidence magically became proof of a deeper cover-up. This completely bizarre conspiracy theory survived entirely because modern political outrage has significantly better funding than basic common sense. 39. American history classes treat the 1862 Homestead Act like the ultimate glorious giveaway, where anyone with tough boots and grit could claim their own massive slice of the frontier. It is an incredibly romantic, rugged myth. In actual practice, the massive land grab was notoriously rigged. The absolute best tracts of dirt quietly flowed straight into the pockets of massive railroad monopolies and wealthy corporate speculators. Meanwhile, Native American nations paid the ultimate bloody price for this free real estate. We completely love celebrating a heartwarming underdog lottery story while completely ignoring the incredibly corrupt forces pulling the strings. 40. Military officials firmly patted returning Vietnam veterans on the back and promised that the millions of gallons of Agent Orange sprayed from the sky posed absolutely zero health risks. That was a deeply calculated, horrific lie. It took decades of agonizing medical diagnoses and declassified internal memos to reveal the government knew exactly how toxic the massive herbicide clouds actually were. Veterans had to navigate an incredibly hostile bureaucratic maze just to get basic medical care. The toxic fog in the jungle was terrible, but the massive fog of public relations messaging kept thousands of families completely in the dark. 41. Millions of Americans confidently told their waiters to absolutely hold the MSG because they were utterly terrified of the mythical Chinese restaurant syndrome. People swore this toxic chemical would instantly trigger migraines and an overwhelming sense of doom. This entire national dietary panic started with literally one single, unverified letter to a medical journal in 1968. It aggressively snowballed into a deeply racist urban legend that survived despite decades of rigorous scientific studies screaming, "The ingredient is perfectly safe." MSG is literally just a delicious flavor compound. The actual danger was the heavy xenophobia sprinkled all over the story. 42. Marketing executives brilliantly labeled the Colt revolver as the legendary gun that single-handedly won the West. It successfully convinced generations that westward expansion was just one incredibly long, heroic shootout between rugged individuals. The extremely boring truth is that a small piece of metal did not conquer a massive continent. The real forces that secured the frontier were aggressive government land policies, highly funded railroad monopolies, and the devastating spread of European diseases among native populations. But the firearms industry completely reduced a brutal era into a shiny leather belt holster because heavy historical nuance is terrible for business. 43. Classic Western television shows instantly teach us that cowboys and Native Americans existed in a permanent, bloody state of constant warfare. The entire entertainment genre requires these two groups to be locked in an endless dramatic shootout. The actual historical frontier was vastly more complicated. Real life involved extensive daily trade networks, deep political alliances, and frequent intermarriage between the groups. The truly devastating conflicts usually arrived much later, orchestrated by broken treaties cooked up by politicians sitting in comfortable Washington offices. But the Hollywood myth desperately needs two distinct costumes shooting at each other to sell movie tickets. 44. Nothing proves the sheer gullibility of the public quite like the infamous New York newspaper panic of 1874. A highly respected paper printed a massive front-page article violently declaring that rhinos, polar bears, and jaguars had escaped the Central Park Zoo and were tearing citizens to shreds. Absolute chaos instantly erupted. Terrified men barricaded themselves indoors with hunting rifles, and schools slammed their doors shut. At the very bottom of the massive column, the author printed a tiny sentence admitting the entire article was a complete work of fiction. Absolute panic heavily outpaces reading comprehension every single time. 45. The tragic saga of the Central Park Five is a brutal reminder that the court of public opinion does not require a jury to completely destroy your life. In 1989, furious New York tabloids instantly convicted 5 innocent teenagers in real time, plastering their faces everywhere and casually labeling them a vicious wolf pack. The aggressive media frenzy effectively ended their lives before a judge even banged a gavel. Years later, actual DNA evidence completely exonerated all of them. But a quiet, polite correction printed on page 12 cannot magically rewind years of heavily destroyed reputations in prison time. 46. One of our favorite historical cartoons features Benjamin Franklin happily flying a flimsy kite in the middle of a raging thunderstorm. The story heavily implies he discovered electricity by accident, acting like a complete lunatic trying to catch a lightning bolt with his bare hands. The absolute truth is vastly less suicidal. Franklin was already a deeply respected scientist who thoroughly understood electrical currents. The kite story was likely an incredibly careful, grounded experiment that was heavily exaggerated by over-enthusiastic storytellers decades later. He definitely did not stand in an open field actively auditioning to win a Darwin Award. 47. Every elementary school bulletin board features the charming tale of Betsy Ross staying up late to heroically stitch the first American flag. It is a beautiful story of patriotic craftsmanship with one glaring problem. Zero historical records from the Revolutionary era actually confirm she did it. The entire legend suspiciously materialized almost a full century later, conveniently promoted by her own grandson, right when the country desperately needed unifying historical heroes. She was undoubtedly a talented upholsterer, but her status as the creator of the Stars and Stripes is pure national branding disguised as historical fact. 48. City planners have spent almost a century aggressively selling the American public on an incredibly expensive lie. They confidently swear that if we just demolish a few more neighborhoods and add 3 massive lanes to the highway, our terrible traffic will magically disappear. The actual science of urban planning completely ruins this promise through induced demand. Every single time you widen a road, it instantly encourages significantly more people to drive until the terrifying gridlock completely returns. We poured trillions of dollars into massive concrete ribbons promising absolute freedom, but physics just keeps sending us daily invoices packed with late fees. 49. Government officials looked straight into the cameras during World War II and confidently claimed the forced relocation of Japanese Americans was an absolute necessity for strict national security. It was a completely horrific, highly coordinated lie. Declassified intelligence records later proved they knew perfectly well there was zero actual military threat. Pure, unadulterated racism and blinding wartime hysteria were completely steering the ship. Thousands of completely innocent citizens lost their homes and freedom behind brutal barbed wire fences. It took decades for the government to finally issue a formal apology, essentially placing a deeply insulting late postage stamp on a constitutional failure. 50. The absolute most devastating legal lie in American history was incredibly brief, clocking in at just 3 words. Separate but equal was a slimy, lawyerly lullaby designed to protect violent racial segregation while casually pretending to respect the Constitution. The separate part was strictly and violently enforced, but the magical equal part conveniently never bothered to show up. A quick glance at the incredibly broken funding of restricted schools heavily told the devastating real story. While the legal doctrine officially died in the Supreme Court, the horrific ghost of that specific lie still aggressively haunts modern school district lines today. I can already hear the furious typing. Which one of these facts absolutely ruined your childhood, and why are you still desperately trying to defend it in the comments? Go ahead, prove me wrong down there. While you're throwing your temper tantrum, aggressively smash the like button and subscribe. We have plenty more of your sacred cows to roast next week.